Imagine living in a nation that believed two vast oceans would forever shield it from war. But then a passenger ship carrying thousands of civilians is sunk. An explosion shakes New York to its core, and a secret telegram promises to give back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to Mexico. All of it made it impossible for America to stand aside any longer. This is the story of how the United States was pulled into the storm of the First World War. Captain Lloyd W. Williams crouched low, the smell of wet earth and gunpowder in his nostrils, as distant thunder rolled across the fields of France. But it was not thunder, it was artillery. The summer of 1918 had turned the quiet woods of Belleau into a furnace. Men of the 5th Marine Regiment advanced cautiously, stepping over churned soil and shattered tree stumps, their boots sinking into mud darkened by rain and blood. They were new to this ground called here to reinforce exhausted French and British allies who had been driven back again and again by the relentless German spring offensives. From the shadows of the dense French woodland figures suddenly burst forth battered French infantry, their uniforms torn, faces ashen with fatigue, rifles slung limply at their sides. The Marines' nerves stretched to snapping instinctively, raised their rifles, fingers tightening around the triggers. But the silhouettes were not the pointed helmets of Germans. Instead, these were their allies, retreating, broken, stumbling past in disarray. A French colonel, mud-splattered and desperate, rushed forward to meet Captain Williams. His English was halting, fragmented by the weight of urgency. He gestured wildly, words tumbling out like fragments of a puzzle the Marines could not solve. Finally, with a snort of frustration, the colonel pulled a notepad from his kit and scrawled an order, shoving it into Williams's hands. Williams read the note, then lifted his eyes to the exhausted faces of his men. Without hesitation, he fixed his bayonet and spat out 6 words that would echo forever in Marine Corps lore. "Retreat, hell, we just got here." Those words, uttered in the thick air of Belleau Wood, became more than defiance. They became prophecy. For over 3 weeks, the Marines would claw their way through the forest inch by inch in one of the bloodiest battles American forces had ever faced. They would fight through tangled underbrush, across open wheat fields swept by machine gun fire, and against seasoned German shock troops who believed the Americans too green, too soft, too late to make a difference. The cost would be staggering, but the legend of the U.S. Marines would be forged in those woods. Belleau Wood was no ordinary battlefield. Before the war, it had been a hunting preserve, a serene landscape of meadows, groves, and wildlife. By June 1918, it was a graveyard of splintered trees, cratered earth, and the stench of decay. The German advance had carried them perilously close to Paris, only 50 miles away. If Belleau fell, the road to the French capital could open. Panic gripped civilians in the city, while French officers quietly wondered if their lines could hold. Into this cauldron marched the Americans, unseasoned, yes, but full of raw confidence. Many had never left their hometowns before crossing the Atlantic. Yet here they were standing shoulder to shoulder with men who had endured 4 years of attrition. To the Europeans, these fresh-faced soldiers seemed like an untapped reservoir of hope. To the Germans, they were an untested threat, perhaps nothing more than cannon fodder. But Belleau Wood would prove them wrong. The Marines fought with ferocity that shocked even their allies. French officers, astonished at their refusal to retreat, later declared that the Americans fought like Les Diables Bleus, the Blue Devils. The name would stick, and Belleau would forever mark the Marines as a force to be feared. And yet, beneath the mythology of Williams' defiant words, there was the grim reality of combat. The screams of wounded men echoing in the forest, the metallic tang of blood carried on the wind, and the sickening rhythm of machine guns mowing down waves of attackers. Heroism and horror were inseparable. Belleau Wood was not just the stage for one man's defiance, it was the crucible in which a nation proved it could bleed for the world beyond its shores. The story of Belleau Wood and of Captain Williams's immortal phrase is more than battlefield bravado. It is the entry point into America's reluctant embrace of global war. From isolation across oceans, the United States had stepped onto the blood-soaked soil of Europe, and once there, they would never be quite the same. Nearly a century before Captain William stood in Belleau Wood, America's first president, George Washington, gave his farewell address to the young republic. His words were sober, almost prophetic. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Washington believed that the new nation, fragile and untested, could only survive if it avoided being drawn into the quarrels of Europe. For decades, that guiding principle shaped the American psyche. By the time Woodrow Wilson entered the White House in 1913, Washington's warning still echoed in political thought. Americans saw themselves as a nation apart, shielded by the Atlantic and Pacific trading, with all but entangled with none. And Wilson himself, a man who presented himself as an intellectual, a reformer, even a moralist, carried the same convictions. Before his inauguration, he remarked almost wistfully, "It would be the irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs." The irony would come. Wilson, the professor turned president, had built his reputation on promises of domestic reform, taming corporate monopolies, improving labor conditions, and ensuring fairness in the American economy. He was not elected as a war leader. He was a man of words and ideals, not a man of guns and trenches. To his supporters, Wilson represented the very opposite of European militarism, a moral counterweight to the old world's obsession with conquest. But history has little regard for the intentions of men. Within a year of his presidency, Europe erupted in fire. In the summer of 1914, a Serbian nationalist bullets in Sarajevo set off a chain reaction of alliances, ultimatums, and mobilizations. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia answered, Germany joined, and France and Britain were pulled in. The continent plunged into the abyss of war. In America, people watched from afar with a mixture of fascination and dread. Newspapers printed vivid accounts of cavalry charges, burning villages, and refugee columns stretching for miles. Yet the United States clung stubbornly to neutrality. To many, this was Europe's quarrel born of dynastic rivalries and imperial ambitions alien to the democratic experiment across the ocean. Still, isolationism was never absolute. American families had roots that tied them emotionally to the conflict. Millions of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe followed the war closely. Their loyalties split. German Americans worried for the Kaiser's armies. Irish Americans cheered Britain's misfortunes, while others prayed for peace in their ancestral homelands. This quilt of allegiances complicated the idea of true neutrality. Wilson knew this. That is why in his speeches he appealed not just for legal neutrality, but for something far deeper. The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought as well as in action. It was an extraordinary demand. He was asking Americans not only to stay out of war, but to discipline their very emotions, to hold back judgment, and as the world burned. But such a request was nearly impossible. War does not respect borders, and neutrality often becomes a thin veil once money trade and morality are involved. The president soon discovered that steering a neutral course through the storm of global war was like trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. Europe's trenches deepened, stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Machine guns, poison gas, and barbed wire turned the fields of France into a vision of hell. By the end of 1914, it was clear this would not be a short war. Wilson watched uneasily as American newspapers filled with images of devastated towns, maimed soldiers, and desperate refugees. The public mood shifted slowly but steadily: pity for the victims, admiration for the Allies, and suspicion toward Germany. The president, meanwhile, tried to mediate. He sent envoys, offered words of conciliation, and hoped that the sheer weight of America's reputation for peace might sway the combatants. It was a noble attempt, but naive. The monarchs and generals of Europe were locked into a death struggle. Wilson's voice, however well-meaning, was little more than an echo carried across the Atlantic. Even so, America's distance from the conflict seemed to reinforce the wisdom of Washington's old advice. Why become entangled? Why spill American blood for European ambitions? On the surface, the United States remained a neutral giant, watching, waiting, and trading. But beneath the calm exterior, the seeds of involvement had already been sown: economic, cultural, and moral ties that would eventually draw the nation into the furnace. Wilson did not know it yet, but his presidency would come to embody the very contradiction he once feared. He would go down in history not as the man who kept America at peace, but as the leader who dragged a reluctant nation into the bloodiest war the world had ever seen. And as soldiers like Captain Williams fixed bayonets in the woods of France, Washington's old warning avoid foreign entanglement seemed less like wisdom and more like an echo from a vanished world. The year was 1914, and though the guns thundered across Europe and the United States, the mood was cautious and distant. The nation separated from the warring continent by two vast oceans saw itself as secure behind what President Theodore Roosevelt had once called its natural moats, the Atlantic to the east and the Pacific to the west. This geography had always shaped America's sense of safety. No invading army could easily cross those expanses. No hostile fleet could quickly storm its shores. Neutrality felt not only natural but inevitable. When hostilities first broke out after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, many Americans were shocked by the sudden descent into chaos, but not surprised that Europe had stumbled into yet another war. For generations, Europeans had fought dynastic wars, imperial wars, wars of nationalism. To Americans watching from across the ocean, it seemed as though the old world had once again set itself on fire. Amid this chaos, Myron T. Herrick, the U.S. ambassador to France, pleaded with Washington to use America's moral authority to calm the flames. Herrick urged that a strong appeal from the president might carry enough weight to slow the rush toward bloodshed. In his words, expression from our nation would have great weight in this crisis. A strong plea for delay and moderation from the President of the United States would meet with respect and approval in Europe. Woodrow Wilson did not disagree with the sentiment, but his instincts urged caution. He chose not to intervene as a mediator, but instead issued a sweeping proclamation of neutrality. His words struck a solemn chord. Americans, he said, must remain neutral in thought as well as in action. It was not simply a legal stance, it was a moral one. A command to the very conscience of the people. To many, this seemed noble. Why let America be pulled into the maelstrom of foreign rivalries? But Wilson's appeal was also a burden. How could a nation of immigrants with millions of citizens whose parents or grandparents hailed from Germany, Ireland, Italy, or Eastern Europe remain impartial in thought? Newspapers in Chicago, Milwaukee, and New York ran headlines that betrayed the biases of their readers. Irish Americans cheered whenever Britain faltered. German Americans sought to defend the honor of their ancestral homeland. Meanwhile, families with ties to Britain or France saw the Allies' plight as their own. Neutrality indeed was one thing. Neutrality in thought was almost impossible. Still, the government attempted to enforce the appearance of impartiality. American banks were initially forbidden from loaning money to any warring nation in hopes that lack of financing might shorten the conflict. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, a staunch pacifist, declared that a nation without access to money could not long maintain a war machine. Perhaps he believed financial neutrality would starve the conflict as surely as any blockade. In practice, however, neutrality quickly proved fragile. The United States had long prided itself on its role as a global trader, sending goods to all corners of the world. When the Allies and Central Powers both sought American wheat, cotton, steel, and oil, businessmen saw no reason to deny either customer. Yet the oceans themselves were treacherous. Britain controlled the seas, its navy tightening a blockade around Germany. As German ships struggled to reach American markets and British buyers had easy access, the flow of goods became lopsided. Ordinary Americans did not yet see this as a betrayal of neutrality. But subtle shifts in trade patterns were already binding America's fortunes to those of the Allied powers. The country's economy began to lean almost unconsciously toward Britain and France. Culturally, too, neutrality was complicated. Reports of German atrocities in Belgium, whether exaggerated or true, fueled anger in American newspapers. Stories of civilians shot, villages burned, and churches destroyed spread quickly, shaping public opinion. The image of poor little Belgium resisting the mighty German Empire became a rallying cry for sympathy. While Wilson preached impartiality, emotions tilted unmistakably toward the Allies. And yet, there was still a stubborn pride in standing apart. Farmers in Kansas or shopkeepers in Ohio felt little urgency to send their sons to fight and die for French fields or British trenches. Sermons in small-town churches urged peace. Editorials spoke of the blessings of distance. The American people, for the most part, wanted to believe that their nation could remain the detached observer, the moral compass, in a world gone mad. This was the paradox of neutrality. It allowed Americans to feel both superior and secure, aloof, yet compassionate. They could lament Europe's tragedy while convincing themselves they had no part in it. Wilson's insistence on neutrality in thought and deed was an attempt to protect this delicate balance. But beneath the surface, the tide was already shifting. The truth was that neutrality was less a fortress than a fragile illusion. Money trade sympathy and eventually outrage would chip away at its walls. The oceans were wide, yes, but ideas and commerce flowed faster than geography could contain. For now, though, in those early years of war, America told itself a comforting story that it was safe behind its moats, that it could remain above the fray. It was a story that would not last. The illusion of neutrality always crumbles first in the marketplace. War may be fought with rifles and artillery, but it is sustained with credit shipping contracts and ledger books. By late 1914, as Europe bled in its trenches, American businessmen were watching with a keen eye. The United States was neutral, yes, but neutrality did not mean silence in commerce. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan believed otherwise. A fiery orator of the old populist school, Bryan had long preached against the corrupting power of gold and bankers. In his eyes, financial entanglements were the surest way to drag America into a war not its own. One cannot fight with an empty war chest, he warned, insisting that the U.S. forbid its banks from lending to any belligerent nation. This, he hoped, would starve the war machine and force peace more swiftly than any treaty. For a brief moment, Bryan's vision held. In 1914, American banks did indeed refuse loans to the warring powers. The nation wore its financial neutrality like a badge of moral superiority. But this restraint proved short-lived. By 1915, Britain's enormous appetite for American goods, grain, steel, oil, cotton, threatened to outpace its cash reserves. London quietly signaled to Washington that without loans, its purchases would dry up. And if Britain could not buy, American farmers and industrialists would suffer. President Wilson, always sensitive to economic pressure, reversed course. The ban on loans was lifted. Suddenly, American banks opened their vaults to the Allies. The floodgates of credit swung wide and dollars poured across the Atlantic in torrents. The consequences were immediate. Between 1915 and 1916, American financiers funneled billions of dollars in credit to Britain and France. That money boomeranged back across the ocean in the form of orders, locomotives, rifles, uniforms, boots, trucks, and millions of tons of wheat and corn. The United States, still neutral on paper, was becoming the arsenal of democracy long before that phrase would ever be coined. The imbalance was glaring. Germany, too, wanted to buy from America. The Kaiser's agents scoured markets for copper nitrates and foodstuffs. But Germany was hemmed in by the British blockade. Neutral ships carrying German-bound goods were stopped, searched, or seized. The ocean routes closed, and with them, German trade collapsed. In 1914, American exports to Germany totaled nearly $350 million. By 1916, that figure had fallen by 99%. The contrast was stark. While Britain's war chest fattened on American loans and goods, Germany was strangled. Neutrality in the strict legal sense still existed, but in practice, America's economy had chosen a side. This uneasy truth did not go unnoticed at home. Pacifists accused Wilson of hypocrisy. German-American newspapers railed that neutrality was being betrayed, that Wall Street bankers were pulling the nation closer to war. Farmers in the Midwest, however, saw only rising prices for wheat and corn. Factory workers in Detroit and Pittsburgh found their hours lengthening, their wages swelling. War, even another's war, was profitable. Wilson himself recognized the contradiction but framed it differently. He insisted that America's role was not to fight, but to supply, that the nation's prosperity and strength could help stabilize the world. In his mind, credit and commerce were tools of peace. But to Germany, the message was unmistakable. the United States had become the financier of its enemies. The cultural divide deepened. Bryan, disillusioned, resigned from Wilson's cabinet in 1915. He could not stomach the shift from strict neutrality to partiality wrapped in legal arguments. His departure was a symbolic moment, the voice of pacifist America walking out the door. With Bryan gone, the road to entanglement seemed less obstructed. Meanwhile, across American society, conversations grew heated. Churches debated the morality of profiting from war. Editorial pages filled with accusations that the nation was selling its soul for profit. Yet in small towns and cities, the reality was more pragmatic. A farmer with debts to pay welcomed the high prices British demand brought. A steelworker with 3 children to feed cared little about neutrality, so long as the mills kept roaring. Neutrality had become, in essence, a balancing act between conscience and commerce. Wilson spoke loftily of impartiality, but his government quietly tilted toward the side that could pay in cash and keep American factories alive. The illusion was cracking and everyone could see it. The United States was not yet a belligerent, but it was no longer a bystander. The tide of dollars had chosen the direction of history long before the tide of soldiers would follow. By the second year of the Great War, American docks were alive with the clang of chains, the shouts of stevedores, and the groan of cargo hoists. Crates of wheat barrels, of oil coils, of copper wire, and stacks of rifles were loaded daily onto freighters bound for Liverpool, Le Havre, and other Allied ports. The United States had declared neutrality, but the shipping manifest told another story. Britain and France became insatiable customers. They bought everything: steel for tanks, nitrates for explosives, grain to feed their soldiers and civilians alike. Factories in the Midwest roared with production, their smokestacks painting the sky gray. Railroads stretched to capacity, hauling raw materials to ports in New York, Boston, and Norfolk. The war was not just being fought in the trenches, it was being fought in American workshops and wheat fields. At first, few saw this as a betrayal of neutrality. After all, the Allies were paying in cash or credit, not demanding soldiers, and business was business, yet the sheer scale of trade created an economic dependency that was difficult to ignore. America's prosperity now rested in large part on Allied victory. Should Britain or France fall, loans might never be repaid. Contracts would collapse, and industries could slump into recession. Neutrality became less an ideal and more a fragile mask over practical self-interest. Germany understood this with growing bitterness. Eager to secure supplies of its own, it turned to neutral carriers, Dutch, Danish, Swedish ships to ferry American goods across the Atlantic. But Britain's Royal Navy ruled the seas. With its blockade tightening like a steel noose, very little reached German ports. Inspectors in London pored over cargo lists, intercepting anything that might aid the Kaiser's armies. Ship after ship was seized or turned back, leaving German warehouses empty and German mouths hungry. Berlin lodged furious protests. Was neutrality not supposed to guarantee equal trade? Was America not obliged to treat both sides fairly? Yet Washington's responses rang hollow. On paper, yes, the US welcomed German business. In practice, the blockade made that business impossible. And when American exporters complained that the blockade hurt their cotton sales to Germany, Britain simply agreed to buy the cotton themselves. The ledger stayed balanced on Allied terms. For American merchants, the profits drowned out any pangs of conscience. Wheat farmers in Kansas cheered as their crops fetched record prices. Southern planters, stung by earlier slumps, rejoiced at booming cotton sales. Midwestern machinists building tractors one year and artillery shells the next saw their wages rise. The war was transforming the American economy into an industrial juggernaut. But there was unease beneath the prosperity. Critics warned that the nation was becoming the silent partner of the Entente. Pacifists spoke of bankers leading the Republic into war, their loans too large to risk losing. Newspapers sympathetic to Germany accused the administration of bowing to Britain's every demand. And in immigrant neighborhoods, German, Irish, even Scandinavian voices of protest grew louder. To them, neutrality looked more like favoritism wrapped in the language of commerce. Still, Wilson held to his careful line. He insisted that America's motives were pure, that trade was not war, and that the Republic remained a disinterested friend to all. But the facts on the ground told a different story. Every freighter that left an American port laden with food and arms for Britain was another invisible thread binding the United States to the fate of the Allies. And as those invisible threads multiplied, it became harder and harder to claim that neutrality was more than a word. America's role as the world's supplier was setting the stage for a harsher truth that a nation so deeply invested in one side's survival could not remain forever outside the war itself. In March 1915, the United States formally protested Britain's blockade of Germany. On paper, the protest was firm, even indignant. American officials declared that Britain had no right to interfere with neutral trade, that starving a civilian population by restricting food shipments was an affront to international law. But the protest went nowhere. Within weeks, quiet negotiations in London transformed outrage into accommodation. Britain agreed to ease its restrictions on cotton, one of America's vital exports, and in return, Washington turned a blind eye to the larger injustice. The result was a strange duality. Officially neutral America bowed again and again to British pressure, while Germany was denied the same consideration. American farmers saw their cotton profits protected, while German citizens tightened their belts under the blockade. It was a compromise of principle sold as pragmatism. To Berlin, the hypocrisy was glaring. If Britain could strangle German trade with impunity, why should Germany not retaliate in kind? In February 1915, the Kaiser's government announced its own countermeasure, a submarine blockade of the British Isles. From now on, any vessel, enemy or neutral, risked being sunk by the prowling U-boats of the Imperial Navy. The contrast between Britain's blockade and Germany's was sharp in the eyes of President Wilson. The British Navy, he argued, might interfere with American goods, but it did not threaten American lives. German submarines, on the other hand, prowled unseen beneath the waves, striking without warning, endangering passengers as well as cargo. To Wilson, this was barbarism disguised as strategy. Yet, the reality was far less dramatic. At the time, Germany had only 9 operational submarines to enforce its blockade. 9 fragile vessels against the might of Britain's merchant fleet and navy. Their effect was more psychological than practical, a new form of warfare that unsettled traditional notions of honor at sea. Still, the threat was enough to spark fear in America. The idea that an invisible predator could strike any ship anywhere without warning stirred deep unease. Wilson's indignation seemed noble to many Americans, but it revealed a double standard that was hard to ignore. If Britain could starve Germany with impunity, why could Germany not starve Britain? If intercepting cargo was acceptable when done by surface ships, why was it villainous when done by submarines? The answer lay not in law, but in perception. Britain was America's cultural cousin, sharing language, institutions, and a sense of heritage. Germany was distant, its guttural language and authoritarian government alien to the American imagination. Reports of atrocities in Belgium painted the Kaiser's armies as brutes, while British propaganda wrapped itself in the language of freedom and civilization. Neutrality in thought, as Wilson had urged, was already unraveling. Americans might still insist they were impartial, but sympathy leaned heavily toward London and Paris. Germany's use of submarines became not a strategic necessity, but a moral outrage. The tension between principle and practice hung heavy. On the docks of New York, longshoremen loaded crates of wheat and rifles destined for Liverpool, while in Berlin, planners plotted their response. If Britain's blockade starved their people, and America ignored the injustice, then Germany would resort to the only weapon that could level the playing field: unrestricted submarine warfare. It was a gamble that would bring tragedy to the Atlantic and push America closer to the edge of war. On May 7, 1915, the illusion of safety at sea shattered. Off the southern coast of Ireland, the great British liner RMS Lusitania steamed steadily through gray Atlantic waters. To its passengers, the voyage seemed almost routine. Children played on the decks, couples strolled arm in arm, and stewards poured wine in the dining rooms. The ship was a floating palace, nearly 800 feet long with gilded interiors and a reputation for speed. But lurking beneath the waves was a Predator U-20, a German submarine commanded by Captain Walter Schwieger. He had been ordered to enforce Germany's blockade by targeting ships bound for Britain. Through his periscope, he saw the Lusitania immense and unmistakable. Though it was a passenger liner, the Germans argued it carried munitions, making it a legitimate target. Schwieger gave the order. A white streak shot through the water. Seconds later, the torpedo slammed into the vessel's hull. The explosion was devastating. Within 18 minutes, the Lusitania had sunk, dragging over 100 souls into the sea, including 128 Americans. Survivors clung to lifeboats or debris, their cries carried on the waves. Newspapers later printed haunting accounts, mothers clutching drowned infants, families separated forever in the chaos. The image of German efficiency turned into merciless murder seared itself into the American mind. The reaction in the United States was swift and furious. Outrage swept the country. Editorials screamed for vengeance. Politicians thundered that Germany had committed an atrocity against civilization itself. The fact that the Lusitania also carried rifle cartridges and artillery shells quietly packed into its hold was downplayed or ignored. To the public, the essential truth was simpler: innocent lives had been slaughtered. Wilson faced the greatest crisis of his presidency. He condemned the attack, but stopped short of demanding war. Instead, he sent stern notes to Berlin warning that any further sinking of passenger ships would provoke grave consequences. Germany, alarmed at the risk of drawing America into the war, issued what became known as the Sussex Pledge, a promise to restrict submarine attacks and spare passenger vessels. For the moment, the crisis cooled. Yet the damage was done. The Lusitania had pierced the American psyche like no diplomatic note ever could. Neutrality, once a proud shield, now seemed a flimsy veil in the face of such horror. The sinking became a rallying cry in taverns, churches, and city streets. Pamphlets and posters depicted the Germans as monsters, Huns who murdered women and children without remorse. Behind this outrage, however, lay deeper forces. The American press had already been tilting against Germany, influenced by British propaganda and cultural affinity. The Lusitania amplified what was already there, cementing Germany's image as a barbaric aggressor. For German Americans, the backlash was immediate and painful. Their neighbors looked at them with suspicion. Their loyalty was questioned. Still, Wilson held back. His famous words, "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight," were mocked by critics, but they revealed his desperate hope to keep America at peace. He believed the United States could act as mediator, not combatant. Yet even he could see that the tide of public opinion was shifting. The Lusitania was not just a ship sunk at sea. It was a symbol of how neutrality could drown in the cold waters of reality. Even as the echoes of the Lusitania tragedy faded, a different kind of war began to smolder within America's borders. It was not fought with rifles or artillery, but with suspicion, prejudice, and fear. The United States in 1915 was a nation of immigrants. German Americans numbered in the millions, the largest non-English-speaking group in the country. They had built breweries and Milwaukee orchestras and Cincinnati newspapers in St. Louis, and churches across Pennsylvania's rolling hills. For decades, their culture thrived, openly blending old traditions with new identities. But the war changed everything. Reports of German atrocities in Belgium, some true, many exaggerated, fueled a narrative that German culture itself was synonymous with militarism and brutality. The sinking of the Lusitania only sharpened the edge. In towns across the Midwest, German names drew suspicion. Businesses advertising in the old language saw customers drift away. School boards debated whether German should even be taught to children. President Wilson did not help. In a speech bristling with hostility, he declared, "Any man who carries a hyphen with him carries a dagger that he is ready to plunge into the vitals of this republic when he gets ready." His words cut deeply. To millions of hyphenated Americans, German American, Irish American, Italian American, it was a public accusation of divided loyalty. But it was German Americans who bore the heaviest burden. Paranoia spread. Vigilante groups patrolled small towns, demanding residents prove their allegiance by buying Liberty bonds or flying the Stars and Stripes. Newspapers printed rumors of German spies lurking in factories or poisoning reservoirs. A man with a foreign accent could be jeered at in the street or worse. The hostilities sometimes turned deadly. In April 1918, Robert Paul Prager, a German-born coal miner in Illinois, was accused of being a spy. A mob dragged him through the streets, wrapped him in an American flag, and lynched him. Prager's pleas of loyalty, his naturalized citizenship, even his service in the local miners' union, none of it mattered. His death was ruled a patriotic act by a jury of his peers. The cultural costs were immense. German-American newspapers shut down by the dozens. Breweries that once proudly advertised German lager rebranded themselves with neutral names. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. Orchestras quietly dropped Beethoven and Wagner from their repertoires. What had once been a vibrant, confident culture was driven into hiding its legacy, muffled by fear. And yet, beneath the ugliness, something larger was taking shape. The prejudice fanned by government propaganda and wartime hysteria revealed how fragile the idea of neutrality truly was. A nation that could not remain neutral toward its own citizens was unlikely to remain neutral toward a world at war. For the German-American community, assimilation became survival. For the United States, paranoia became policy. And for Wilson, the president who had once preached neutrality in thought and deed, the very fabric of his society was unraveling into mistrust. Neutrality was no longer a shield. It had become a knife cutting neighbor from neighbor. And as suspicion deepened, the nation inched ever closer to abandoning the very principle it had tried so desperately to uphold. If suspicion and paranoia burned in the hearts of Americans, a single night in the summer of 1916 poured fuel onto that fire. It happened not in Europe's trenches, but in the shadow of New York City's skyline, on a tiny spit of land called Black Tom Island. Black Tom was no island of leisure. It was an industrial hub, a storage depot for mountains of explosives destined for the Allies. Boxcars lined its tracks, stuffed with rifle cartridges, TNT, and artillery shells. Barges moored to its piers sagged under the weight of high explosives. By late July, the value of munitions piled on Black Tom reached over $20 million, a staggering sum worth billions in today's money. In the early hours of July 30th, 1916, watchmen noticed small fires flickering in a freight car. Moments later, the night erupted. The first explosion tore through the darkness with the force of a small earthquake. Windows shattered across Manhattan and Jersey City. At 2:08 a.m., a second, even more powerful blast thundered outward, sending shockwaves that rattled buildings as far away as Philadelphia. Seismographs at Princeton recorded tremors equivalent to a magnitude 5 earthquake. The Statue of Liberty just across the harbor shuddered violently. Her torch-bearing arm was damaged, and shards of stained glass from her windows rained into the pedestal below. Panic engulfed the city. Families leapt from their beds, convinced the Germans had launched an air raid. Dock workers and firemen rushed toward the inferno, only to be hurled back by further detonations as boxcars ignited like dominoes. For hours, shells exploded in deadly fireworks, streaking arcs of flame across the harbor. By dawn, Black Tom was a smoldering crater 110 by 50 meters wide, and fragments of metal were found embedded in buildings miles away. The destruction was immense. Millions of dollars in munitions lost, warehouses leveled, homes and businesses shattered. Yet perhaps most shocking was the revelation that this was no accident. Investigators uncovered evidence that German agents, desperate to halt the flow of American arms to the Allies, had infiltrated the island and set the fires. The implications were staggering. German sabotage had reached American soil. The United States, still officially neutral, had been struck like a combatant. Though Berlin denied involvement, the evidence was damning. And for the American public, the message was unmistakable. Neutrality did not guarantee safety. The attack inflamed anti-German sentiment further. Newspapers demanded vengeance. Politicians thundered about treachery in the night. For German Americans, the already suffocating atmosphere grew even darker. To many of their neighbors, Black Tom was proof that the enemy was not just over there in Europe, it was here, hidden among them. The Black Tom explosion left scars that lingered for decades. The Statue of Liberty's torch, damaged beyond repair, was never restored. Visitors today climb to her crown, but not her arm. Lawsuits over the sabotage dragged on until after the Second World War, when Germany finally paid reparations. But the deepest scar was psychological. Black Tom revealed that the United States could not remain a safe island in a world consumed by war. The ocean moats that Washington once celebrated had failed. The flames in New York Harbor were a grim foreshadowing America's neutrality was burning away, and soon the nation itself would be pulled into the inferno. By early 1917, Germany faced a grim reality. Its people were starving under the relentless British blockade, its armies locked in stalemate, and its chances of victory dwindling with each passing month. Desperation drove German planners to a fateful conclusion: only by cutting off Britain's lifeline of supplies could the war be won. And the only weapon capable of doing so lay beneath the waves. Thus, the German High Command resurrected a strategy they had once shelved under American pressure: unrestricted submarine warfare. Every ship bound for Britain, whether British, French, or neutral, would be considered a target. Merchantmen, freighters, even liners would be fair game. The gamble was audacious: starve Britain into submission before the United States could react. When news of this policy reached Washington, it struck like a thunderclap. President Wilson had staked his foreign policy on the idea that Germany would honor its earlier pledges that humanity and reason would restrain their use of submarines. Instead, the Kaiser's government had thrown caution aside. Wilson's response was to sever diplomatic ties with Berlin. Still, he hesitated to call for war. He clung to the hope that America might defend itself without plunging fully into the conflict. The policy, he announced, was one of armed neutrality. American merchant ships would now sail the Atlantic with defensive guns mounted on their decks, and their crews authorized to fire on any attacker. It was a bold assertion of rights, but also a precarious half-measure. Armed neutrality meant confrontation was inevitable. It was only a matter of time before a U.S. ship fired or was sunk. Life aboard those ships became a daily gamble. Imagine the anxiety of sailors steaming across the Atlantic, eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale ripple of a periscope. They slept lightly boots beside their bunks, knowing a torpedo could strike at any hour. Merchant captains zigzagged their courses, dousing lights at night, praying the darkness would hide them from prowling U-boats. Every creak of the hull, every splash against the bow could set hearts racing. The Germans knew the risk. Their diplomats warned the Kaiser that America might be driven into war. But the generals argued otherwise. The United States had no real army, only a token force. Even if it declared war, it would take years to mobilize. By then, Britain would already be starved to its knees. It was a dangerous miscalculation. Each torpedo launched against neutral shipping pushed the United States closer to open conflict. American papers ran stories of sunken freighters, lost sailors' widows left behind. The cry for action grew louder. Wilson, who had won re-election just months earlier on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," now found himself cornered by events beyond his control. The oceans had become a killing ground. And while Wilson still resisted the call to arms, the tide was running against him. Each ship that slipped beneath the waves eroded the illusion of neutrality until at last one final spark would ignite the fire. In late February 1917, as Wilson struggled to preserve armed neutrality, a diplomatic bombshell detonated in Washington. British intelligence, which had been intercepting German communications for years, handed the US government a secret telegram that would electrify the nation. It came from Arthur Zimmermann, Germany's foreign minister. Sent to the German ambassador in Mexico, the message was chillingly direct. If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico should join the Central Powers. In return, Germany promised to help Mexico regain its lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The plan was desperate, even fantastical. Mexico was still reeling from revolution plagued by civil unrest and economic collapse. Its army was ill-prepared for a full-scale invasion of its northern neighbor. Yet the mere suggestion that Germany was conspiring to carve up American soil was incendiary. When Wilson released the telegram to the public, the reaction was immediate. Newspapers splashed it across their front pages in bold, outraged headlines. In bars and barbershops, Americans pored over the words in disbelief. Was this not proof at last that Germany saw the United States not as a neutral bystander, but as an enemy to be undermined? The timing could not have been more explosive. German submarines were already sinking American ships with alarming frequency. Now here was evidence of a plot to unleash war on American soil. The combination was too much for public opinion to bear. Outrage swept across the country, and even the most cautious voices began to demand action. Mexico, for its part, politely declined the invitation. President Venustiano Carranza, beset by his own internal struggles, knew the proposal was a fantasy. He quietly dismissed the idea, recognizing that picking a fight with the United States would mean national suicide. But that hardly mattered. The damage had already been done. In Washington, Wilson gathered his cabinet and read the telegram aloud. The response was unanimous war. Not negotiation, not neutrality, but war. The message had unified his advisors as nothing else could. And yet for Wilson, the moment was bittersweet. He had campaigned as a man of peace, promising mothers that their sons would not be sent into Europe's slaughterhouse. Now faced with sabotage, submarine warfare, and the Zimmermann conspiracy, he could no longer stand apart. The president took to Congress, his voice heavy with the weight of history. Germany's actions, he declared, were nothing less than a declaration of war upon the United States. For a nation that had clung so fiercely to isolation, the words were both shocking and inevitable. Across America, crowds gathered in town squares and city streets, reading the news from bulletins tacked to walls. The telegram had done what years of propaganda, outrage, and diplomacy could not. It shattered the illusion that America could remain untouched. Neutrality was dead. The march to war had begun. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson walked solemnly into the chamber of the United States Congress. The hall was packed, every seat filled the galleries, crowded with spectators who had come to witness history. Wilson, usually calm and professorial, carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders. For 3 years, he had resisted the call to arms. But now, with American ships sunk, sabotage on American soil, and the treachery of the Zimmermann telegram exposed, he could resist no longer. His speech was deliberate, measured, but carried a moral fire that resonated through the chamber. He did not frame the conflict as a war of conquest or vengeance. Instead, he invoked higher ideals. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. These words soared above the immediate crisis, transforming the war into a crusade for universal principles. For many Americans, Wilson's address was electrifying. It recast their role not as reluctant participants, but as champions of freedom against autocracy. The German Empire was no longer just another European power, it was a menace to civilization itself. When the roll call was taken, the outcome was decisive. The Senate voted 82-6 in favor of war. 4 days later, the House of Representatives echoed the decision 373-50. On April 6, 1917, Wilson signed the resolution. The United States was now at war with Germany. The reaction in the streets was swift and thunderous. Bells rang from church towers. Crowds poured into city squares, waving flags and singing patriotic songs. Bands played the Star-Spangled Banner, and over there, posters urging men to enlist appeared overnight in shop windows and on lampposts. Mothers wept, fathers clenched their jaws, and young men lined up outside recruiting stations, some afraid, others eager, most uncertain of what awaited them across the ocean. Yet beneath the waves of patriotic fervor lay unease. America had never before sent its armies into the heart of Europe. Its military was small compared to the titanic forces already clashing on the Western Front. Critics wondered how the Republic could possibly influence a struggle so vast and entrenched. Was Wilson's lofty vision of making the world safe for democracy anything more than rhetoric? Still, the symbolism of America's entry reverberated worldwide. In Paris and London, people cheered, convinced that the tide had turned. In Berlin, leaders grimaced, recognizing the danger of awakening a giant with nearly limitless manpower and resources. Neutral nations watching from the sidelines adjusted their calculations. For Wilson himself, the declaration was both vindication and tragedy. He had delayed as long as he could, hoping to shield his people from Europe's carnage. But once he crossed the threshold, he cast the war in the grandest possible terms. This was not simply America joining a conflict. It was America taking its place on the stage of history. And so the Great Mobilization began. The factories, farms, and families of the United States would soon be harnessed for war. The nation that had once prided itself on distance from Europe's quarrels was now a belligerent bound to the fate of its allies. The die was cast, and there would be no turning back. When Congress declared war in April 1917, the United States possessed a professional army of just over 120,000 men, smaller than Portugal's, and dwarfed by the millions already entrenched in Europe. It was an army suited for guarding borders, chasing bandits, or occupying islands in the Philippines, not storming machine gun nests in France. Wilson, in a moment of candor, admitted that the simple act of entering the war might matter more than the soldiers America could field immediately. But words alone could not fight in the trenches. The solution was the Selective Service Act of 1917, a measure that authorized conscription on a scale the nation had never attempted. Registration began on June 5th. Across the country, young men lined up outside courthouses, post offices, and schoolhouses to fill out draft cards. By the end of the war, nearly 24 million Americans had registered, and 2.8 million would be drafted into service. The draft was not without controversy. Some saw it as an infringement on liberty, and protests flared in places like Oklahoma, where farmers resisted what they viewed as government overreach. But the majority complied, and the system brought order to what might otherwise have been chaos. Alongside the conscripts were volunteers, some 2 million men who stepped forward without waiting for their names to be called. Among them were young idealists stirred by Wilson's rhetoric, adventurous souls eager for the fight, and immigrants who saw service as a path to full acceptance in their adopted country. Training camps sprang up almost overnight. At places like Camp Upton in New York and Camp Funston in Kansas, recruits were issued uniforms that often didn't fit, given rifles, sometimes older than they were, and taught to march in dusty fields where barracks were hastily hammered together. The scale was immense. Entire cities of soldiers rising on the American plains. Inexperienced lieutenants drilled companies of farm boys, shop clerks, and factory workers into cohesion. The task of molding this raw force fell to General John J. Blackjack Pershing, appointed commander of the American Expeditionary Force (AEF). Pershing was no stranger to combat. He had fought in the Spanish-American War and the Philippines, and recently led an expedition into Mexico in pursuit of Pancho Villa. Stern, disciplined, and uncompromising, Pershing insisted that American soldiers would not be fed piecemeal into British and French units. They would fight as a unified American army, preserving national pride and proving their mettle as equals. There was one notable exception: African American troops. Segregated by policy, many black soldiers were denied the chance to fight under the American flag. Units such as the Pomar's 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, were assigned to the French army, which welcomed them and equipped them with French rifles and helmets. In France, these men distinguished themselves in combat, earning the Croix de Guerre and the admiration of their allies. At home, however, their contributions were too often overshadowed by prejudice. Mobilization was not limited to soldiers. On the home front, the government launched massive propaganda campaigns through the Committee on Public Information, plastering cities with posters that urged men to enlist and families to support them. Uncle Sam. Once you became the iconic image of recruitment. Music halls echoed with George M. Cohan's jaunty tune "Over There," promising that the Yanks are coming. To finance the war, the Treasury issued Liberty bonds sold with fervor at rallies across the country. Movie stars like Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford appeared on stage to promote bond sales, while Boy Scouts marched door to door collecting subscriptions. Buying a bond became a patriotic duty, and refusal invited suspicion. Women too found new roles. With millions of men in uniform, women stepped into factories, offices, and farms. They served as nurses overseas, as telephone operators nicknamed Hello Girls, and as volunteers in the Red Cross. Their contributions fueled the growing momentum of the women's suffrage movement, which would achieve victory just after the war's end. Within a year, the United States had transformed itself. From a small peacetime army, it now boasted millions in uniformed ships carrying men and supplies across the Atlantic, and a society mobilized on every front. The task was enormous, the sacrifices great, but the momentum was unstoppable. For America, the age of isolation was over. The nation had stepped decisively onto the world stage, its factories, farms, and families bound to the fortunes of war. And soon in the mud of France, the first test of this vast mobilization would come. By the spring of 1918, the American Expeditionary Force had begun to arrive in Europe in real numbers. The French and British, exhausted after nearly 4 years of slaughter, greeted them with a mixture of hope and skepticism. These newcomers were fresh, yes, but untested. Could raw American troops, drilled hastily in camps back home, stand against the hardened stormtroopers of the Kaiser? The first test came at a small French village called Cantigny in late May. Perched on high ground, the village was a thorn in the Allied line held firmly by German defenders, who believed the Americans were too green to take it. General Pershing chose the U.S. 1st Division, the Big Red One, to make the assault. At dawn on May 28, 1918, under the thunder of French artillery, American infantry surged forward. Tanks ground ahead, flamethrower teams advanced, and the doughboys' rifles, fixed with bayonets, charged through smoke and gunfire. For hours, the village was a furnace of bullets and shell fire. When the Germans counterattacked, the Americans clung to their gains, refusing to yield. After 2 days of savage fighting, Cantigny was firmly in Allied hands. The victory was small in territory, but enormous in meaning. For the first time, the U.S. Army had taken and held ground in Europe. French morale soared, and the Germans realized the Americans were no longer an abstract threat, but a new force to be reckoned with. Yet Cantigny was only the prelude. The true crucible awaited just days later in a dark tangle of forest known as Belleau Wood. In June 1918, German armies launched a fresh offensive that smashed through French lines and threatened Paris itself. To plug the gap, the French called on the Americans. Among those sent were the U.S. Marines of the 5th and 6th Regiments. As they moved into position near the Marne River, retreating French soldiers urged them to turn back. The enemy was too strong, they warned. But Captain Lloyd W. Williams answered with words that would echo through history: retreat, hell. We just got here. The battle that followed was one of the most brutal the Marines would ever fight. Belleau Wood, once a hunting preserve, became a killing ground of shattered trees and tangled underbrush. German machine guns swept the open wheat fields, mowing down Americans as they advanced. The Marines attacked again and again, often at bayonet point, clawing their way through a forest that seemed determined to devour them. For 3 weeks, the fighting raged. Entire companies were reduced to handfuls of survivors. The air was thick with smoke, the ground littered with bodies. Yet the Marines would not yield. French officers, astonished at their ferocity, nicknamed them Les Teufelshunde, the Devil Dogs. By the end of June, Belleau Wood was in American hands. The cost was staggering: thousands dead and wounded, but the victory was undeniable. The Marines had stopped the German advance and etched their legend into military history. For the Allies, Belleau Wood was a turning point. The Americans were no longer untested recruits. They were warriors who could fight and die beside their comrades. For the Germans, it was a grim revelation the fresh flood of American manpower would not be easily dismissed. And for the United States, it was a baptism of fire. From Cantigny to Belleau Wood, the doughboys had proven themselves in blood and sacrifice. They were no longer a neutral nation's sons. They were part of the great struggle that would decide the fate of Europe. By the fall of 1918, the United States was no longer a hesitant newcomer, but a massive presence on the Western Front. Over 1.2 million American soldiers were now in France, the largest overseas deployment in U.S. history up to that time. General Pershing had resisted pressure to scatter his men among British and French units. Now he would unleash them in a campaign designed to break the German army once and for all. The target was the Meuse-Argonne region, a rugged stretch of forests, hills, and ravines guarding the German rail hub at Sedan. Cutting through this bastion would sever German supply lines and force them into retreat. The task was daunting. The terrain was treacherous, the defenses layered with barbed wire machine gun nests and concrete pillboxes. And the German army, though weary, remained deadly. On September 26, 1918, the offensive began. At dawn, American artillery roared to life, over 4,000 guns firing more shells in a single morning than the United States had produced during the entire Civil War. Doughboys surged forward, bayonets fixed into the fog of smoke and mud. For many, it was their first battle. For others, it was their last. Progress was painfully slow. Units became lost in the dense Argonne forest, their maps useless amid the tangled ravines. Communication broke down, field telephones, cut runners lost carrier pigeons shot from the sky. German machine gunners firing from camouflaged nests cut swaths through advancing waves. Entire companies were pinned down, clinging to shallow foxholes as artillery churned the earth around them. Adding to the misery was the Spanish flu, which ravaged the ranks as fiercely as enemy fire. Soldiers coughed blood into their gas masks, fevers burning even as they staggered forward. The flu would ultimately kill more American soldiers in 1918 than German bullets. But in the midst of battle, there was no time to count. Pershing pressed on relentlessly. The offensive was as much a test of endurance as of tactics. Inexperienced divisions rotated and battered ones staggered out, and the relentless grind continued. The Americans lacked the polish of their European allies, but they compensated with sheer determination. Officers later described scenes of chaos transformed by bursts of heroism, small groups of doughboys storming machine gun nests, farm boys from Iowa hurling grenades into concrete bunkers, immigrants fighting side by side for a country many had barely known before shipping out. For the French, who had endured years of attrition, the sight of Americans pouring into the line by the hundreds of thousands was both astonishing and inspiring. French generals who once doubted Pershing now admitted that without the AEF, the war might drag on indefinitely. The Meuse-Argonne became the crucible of the American war effort. Villages changed hands multiple times. Rivers were crossed under fire. Forests turned into charnel houses of splintered trees and shallow graves. In the end, it was less about brilliance of strategy than about wearing down an exhausted enemy. Each yard gained came at staggering cost, but the pressure never ceased. By early November, the Germans were reeling. Their lines bent, then broke. The American advance pushed closer to Sedan, threatening the very arteries of the German army. The once proud Kaiser's forces were now retreating, harried and on the brink of collapse. The Meuse-Argonne offensive lasted 47 days, the longest battle in U.S. military history. More than 26,000 Americans were killed, and over 95,000 wounded, a toll greater than any other campaign the nation had fought before or since. Yet the sacrifice was not in vain. The relentless drive of Pershing's army helped force Germany to the negotiating table, paving the way for the armistice. For America, the Meuse-Argonne was both triumph and tragedy. It was the moment the nation proved its strength on the world stage, but also the moment it learned the true cost of modern war. Young men who had grown up in quiet towns and farms now lay beneath foreign soil, their graves stretching in endless rows across the hills of France. The United States had passed its trial by fire, and though the guns would soon fall silent, the echoes of the Argonne would shape a generation. Amid the vastness of the Meuse-Argonne, where whole divisions struggled and bled, stories of individual heroism emerged, tales that captured the imagination of soldiers at the front and citizens at home. They became symbols, legends, and reminders that even in industrialized slaughter, one person's courage could alter the tide. One such story belonged to Corporal Alvin Cullum York, a farmer from the Tennessee hills. York was no natural soldier. A devout man, he had wrestled with the morality of killing, nearly refusing service on religious grounds. Yet when called to fight, he obeyed. On October 8, 1918, during an assault near the village of Châtel-Chehéry, York's unit stumbled upon a heavily defended German position. Machine guns raked the Americans, cutting down men in swaths. Chaos reigned. Amid the carnage, York took charge. Moving with uncanny calm, he used his rifle with deadly precision, picking off German gunners one by one. When they rushed him, he drew his pistol, felling attackers at close range. In less than an hour, he killed 25 enemy soldiers and forced 132 others to surrender. Stunned comrades watched as York marched his prisoners back to American lines, an entire German battalion disarmed by a single determined man. For this feat, York was awarded the Medal of Honor and became a national hero, though he himself remained humble, insisting it was God's hand that guided him. If York represented the reluctant hero, another rising figure embodied audacity and ambition, Douglas MacArthur. Then a brigadier general in the 42nd Rainbow Division, MacArthur had already earned a reputation for bravery bordering on recklessness. He often appeared at the front without a gas mask, clad in a flamboyant scarf. Instead of regulation gear, a swagger that infuriated some but inspired many. In the thick of the Meuse-Argonne fighting, the Rainbow Division was tasked with storming the formidable defenses at Côte de Châtillon, a fortress of wire pillboxes and interlocking fire that had repulsed earlier assaults. American troops were mauled, trying to take it pinned under murderous machine gun fire. MacArthur, refusing to accept defeat personally, scouted the German defenses under fire, exposing himself again and again to enemy fire to rally his men. His aggressive leadership, combined with the relentless determination of the guardsmen under his command, finally cracked the position. Côte de Châtillon fell, and with it a critical link in the German defensive chain. For his actions, MacArthur earned yet another citation for gallantry, cementing his reputation as one of America's most daring officers. These stories. York's humble precision, MacArthur's fearless audacity spread quickly through the ranks and then across the Atlantic. Newspapers in the United States seized upon them, printing illustrations and glowing accounts. For a public anxious about the fate of their sons, such tales offered reassurance. Americans were not only fighting, they were excelling. Yet for every York or MacArthur, there were thousands of nameless men who fought with equal courage, but never made headlines. The doughboys who carried ammunition under fire, the stretcher bearers who dragged the wounded from no man's land, the signalmen who strung wire through shell fire, all played their part in the grinding advance. Their stories were seldom told, but their sacrifice was no less real. The creation of heroes served another purpose. It transformed the war from a faceless industrial slaughter into a narrative of valor. Americans back home who could not comprehend the mud and gas of the Argonne could at least understand the bravery of a man from Tennessee or a flamboyant general in a rainbow patch. These figures became living symbols of what the nation believed itself to be: resilient, fearless, destined to prevail. As the offensive pressed on and the German lines began to crumble, the legend of American heroism grew. It was not that York or MacArthur alone won the war, but in their actions, Americans found a mirror of their own transformation from isolationist observers to decisive actors on the world stage. The war was entering its final days, but the memory of these heroes would endure long after the guns fell silent. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world exhaled. Church bells rang across Europe, and America's soldiers embraced civilians, danced in the streets. The war to end all wars had ended. But victory brought not only relief, it brought questions. What kind of peace would follow such devastation? President Woodrow Wilson believed he had the answer. Even before the armistice, he had laid out a blueprint for a new world order, the 14 points. Announced in January 1918, these principles were not about punishing the enemy, but about creating a fair and lasting peace. They called for freedom of the seas, open diplomacy, without secret treaties, arms reductions, and self-determination for oppressed nationalities. Most ambitious of all was Wilson's vision of a League of Nations, a permanent body where disputes could be settled by dialogue rather than war. To many Americans weary of carnage, the 14 points sounded noble, even idealistic. Newspapers praised Wilson as a prophet, and in Europe, war-weary populations embraced his rhetoric with enthusiasm. In villages and cities across the continent, people cheered when they heard America's president speak of justice rather than revenge. For a brief moment, Wilson was the most admired statesman in the world. But admiration was not the same as acceptance. When Wilson sailed to Europe to attend the peace conference at Versailles, he carried not only his ideals, but also the weight of American expectations. No U.S. president had ever taken such a direct role in foreign negotiations. He was greeted like a savior in Paris, with crowds lining the streets to cheer his motorcade. Yet inside the gilded halls of Versailles, he encountered a harsher reality. The French, led by Georges Clemenceau, wanted security above all. Their country had been ravaged by German invasions twice in half a century. Clemenceau demanded harsh reparations and territorial guarantees to ensure Germany could never again threaten France. The British, under David Lloyd George, sought to balance punishment with pragmatism, securing their empire while keeping Germany weak enough to prevent rivalry but strong enough to trade. Wilson's lofty principles often clashed with these hard demands. He spoke of self-determination, yet the map of Europe bristled with contradictions. How to balance the claims of Poles, Czechs, and South Slavs against those of Hungarians, Austrians, and Turks. How to grant freedom to colonial peoples when Britain and France intended to expand their empires through mandates carved from Ottoman and German lands. Even his own advisors doubted him. Secretary of State Robert Lansing warned that the principle of self-determination was simply loaded with dynamite. It raised hopes that could never be fulfilled and would unleash more conflicts than it resolved. Wilson, however, clung to his vision. He compromised reluctantly on many points, allowing harsh reparations against Germany and the carving up of colonial territories. But he fought fiercely for the League of Nations. To him, the League was the keystone. Even if the treaty had flaws, the League could correct them over time. In June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Germany accepted responsibility for the war, was stripped of territory, disarmed, and burdened with crushing reparations. The League of Nations was established, enshrined as Wilson's triumph amid the compromises. Yet back in the United States, the reception was cold. Senators bristled at the idea of binding America's future to an international organization. Critics accused Wilson of abandoning his promise of peace without victory and delivering instead a punitive treaty that betrayed his own principles. The nation, eager to demobilize and return to normalcy, recoiled from the burdens of world leadership. Wilson embarked on a grueling speaking tour, pleading with the American people to support the League. He poured his soul into the effort, warning that without such a body, another war was inevitable. But exhaustion and illness struck him down. In October 1919, he collapsed from a massive stroke, leaving him incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency. The Senate ultimately rejected the Treaty of Versailles. The United States never joined the League of Nations. Wilson's dream of a new world order collapsed, leaving him a broken man. Yet his words to make the world safe for democracy echoed long after. They inspired later generations, from Franklin Roosevelt's United Nations to the global order of the 20th century. For the soldiers who had fought, the outcome felt bittersweet. They had bled in the Argonne, triumphed at Belleau Wood, marched through ruined villages, and buried their comrades in foreign soil. They expected a peace worthy of their sacrifice. What they received was a treaty that sowed seeds of bitterness and division, particularly in Germany, where humiliation and resentment would fester. The war had ended, but the peace was fragile. And though Wilson's ideals had faltered, the idea that America could shape the destiny of nations had taken root. The United States had crossed a threshold. It could never again return fully to the isolation of Washington's advice. The world had changed, and America with it. The cannons fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. Yet for the United States, the end of the First World War did not bring clarity. It brought contradiction. America had crossed the ocean, fought in Europe, and sacrificed over 116,000 lives. Its armies had turned the tide of battle. Its president had tried to reshape the world. And yet, almost as quickly as the war had ended, the American people yearned to pull back to retreat once more behind the ocean moats that had sheltered them for so long. The debate over the Treaty of Versailles crystallized this divide. When the Senate rejected the treaty in 1919, it was more than a rejection of Wilson's League of Nations. It was a rejection of the idea that America should be permanently entangled in world affairs. Lawmakers feared that joining the League would surrender the nation's independence, obligating it to fight in wars not of its choosing. The result was a return to the language of isolation. America would trade. America would prosper, but America would not police the globe. For Wilson, the failure was devastating. Stricken by illness, he watched his vision crumble from the confines of the White House. His dream of a peace built on cooperation had given way to old rivalries and resentments. In Germany, bitterness festered under the weight of reparations and humiliation. In Eastern Europe, borders drawn in haste ignited ethnic conflicts. In the Middle East, mandates carved from Ottoman lands sowed seeds of unrest that would endure for a century. Wilson had wanted to make the world safe for democracy. Instead, the peace settlement left the world pregnant with new wars. Back home, the consequences of the war lingered in quieter, but no less profound ways. German Americans, once the proud keepers of a vibrant culture, now retreated into silence. Before the war, nearly 1 in 4 high school students studied German. By 1918, only 1% did. German-language newspapers folded churches, abandoned their native hymns, and entire communities rebranded themselves with Anglo names. To survive, they assimilated bearing traditions that had once been celebrated openly. The economic boom of wartime gave way to the uncertainties of peace. Factories that had thrived on contracts for shells and rifles now faced layoffs. Returning soldiers hailed as heroes struggled to find work. Many came home scarred, physically maimed, or haunted by the invisible wounds of trench warfare. They carried with them the memories of gas masks, of mud and wire, of comrades who never returned. America's innocence had been shattered, and the scars of the Argonne and Belleau Wood remained etched in the minds of a generation. Yet amid the disillusionment, a subtle transformation had occurred. The war had introduced America to the responsibilities of great power. It had tested the nation's ability to raise armies, project power, and shape international affairs. Though isolationist voices prevailed in the 1920s, the memory of America's decisive role lingered. The world now looked to the United States as a power that could no longer be ignored. Ordinary citizens felt this paradox too. On one hand, they longed for a return to normalcy, the phrase popularized by Warren G. Harding in the 1920 election. On the other, they knew that something fundamental had shifted. America was no longer just a land of opportunity across the sea. It was a nation whose actions could alter the fate of continents. The League of Nations, established without American participation, faltered in the decades that followed. Its authority was tested and found wanting when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, when Italy attacked Ethiopia in 1935, and when Germany openly defied its restrictions under Adolf Hitler. Each failure reminded the world of the absence of American resolve. Each crisis hinted that the war to end all wars had been no such thing. In hindsight, the First World War was both an ending and a beginning. It ended Europe's illusion of unstoppable progress, shattering empires that had stood for centuries. And it began America's uneasy journey from isolation to leadership, a journey that would not be completed until the fires of a second, even greater war forced the United States to take the center stage it had once tried to avoid. For the men who had marched through the mud of France, for the families who hung gold stars in their windows, for the immigrants who proved their loyalty in uniform, the war left a legacy of pride and loss. They had fought over there, believing their sacrifice would bring lasting peace. Instead, they returned to a world where peace was fragile, where new storms gathered on the horizon. And so the story of America in the First World War closes with a paradox. A nation that had tried to heed Washington's warning against foreign entanglements had found itself in the very heart of Europe's catastrophe. A nation that had insisted on neutrality had become the arsenal and savior of its allies. A nation that had sought to return to its old ways had in truth been transformed forever. The echoes of Belleau Wood, Satania of Black Tom of the Argonne, they did not fade, they lingered, whispering that America's future lay not in retreat, but in engagement. The First World War was over, but its shadow stretched long, pointing toward the conflicts and the responsibilities that awaited in the century to come.